back to Module 1. Here we're looking at really kind of a foundation of understanding what special education looks like in today's schools. And I think the authors really laid out well the IDEA 6 principles and the things that we need to really make sure we're on top of, we keep in mind as we're working with students with disabilities. These 6 principles are really critical for us. And so I really want to take a look at each of these kind of in detail, a little bit more detail than they talked about within the text. So the first principle they looked at was zero reject. Here we're talking about preventing the exclusion of students with disabilities from a free, appropriate public education. Okay, so zero reject means that when we're disciplining students, if we feel there's a need for expulsion or suspension, there are steps that we have to take because that student has a disability. Okay, so we're really looking at discipline here. One of the key aspects we have to remember is no secession. Okay, so that means that really within a given school year, legally, we cannot expel or suspend a student with disabilities for more than 10 school days without taking some pretty critical steps for doing that. So that's important to remember. If we have a student that's struggling to demonstrate the appropriate behaviors, as a team, we've decided that suspension is necessary or expulsion is necessary. Well, there are steps that we have to take place. Now, we are not required legally to provide services during those 10 days that the student is out of school. So there is some breathing room there for some short-term removals, right, without providing services. But once we reach that 10-day period, then there's some things that have to go into place. That's where we really look at that manifestation determination. So we really have to determine for our students with disabilities whether their behavior was caused by the disability or it had a direct or substantial relationship to the disability. Okay? And when it does, or the other piece of this is when we're evaluating what occurred, and that requires suspension, was the student's conduct a result of the direct failure of the school to implement the student's IEP? We have to consider that, right? So we have to consider whether the behavior contributed to it, that was related to the disability, or whether the school was not implementing the IEP correctly and that contributed to the behavior occurring. This is really important for us to remember as we look at disciplining students. So one of the things that we have to do once we do that is we have to conduct a functional behavior assessment. So let's say we have a student on the autism spectrum. They become physical with another student, and we're looking at suspension because of that. Okay? What we need to do next is we have to determine, did that behavior occur because of their autism? And if so, we have to do a functional behavior assessment and develop a behavior intervention plan. Okay? There are 3 things that can occur that do allow you to place a student in an interim alternative education setting for up to 45 days. Okay? And that is if a student brings a weapon to school, if a student brings drugs to school, or if an injury occurs because of the student's behavior. So if that student on the spectrum injured another student or injured a teacher or a para, the school does have leeway to put that student in an alternative education setting for up to 45 days without making any kind of determination of manifestation. Okay? So I think that's important for us to remember too, is there is some leeway there in terms of placing a student in an alternative education setting for up to 45 days. Oftentimes that's a much better option than doing a suspension and just sending them home. That alternative education setting can be a much better placement for them if those situations occur where we have weapons, drugs, or injury involved. The second principle of IDEA is non-discriminatory evaluation requirements. So schools are required to provide a non-discriminatory evaluation to identify if a disability exists, okay? And then identify special education services and related services that would address that disability. So a non-discriminatory evaluation means that we are going to, when we're evaluating a student, we're going to use appropriate evaluations, okay? So things like language barriers, things like learning abilities that can't impact that evaluation. Or for example, Josie, since she's nonverbal in signs, the appropriate evaluation tools have to be selected for her to really allow her to demonstrate her knowledge, okay? And then allows us to identify if a disability exists. Typically, that non-discriminatory evaluation is going to be a range of tools. It's not going to be one test. We don't use one test to identify if there's a disability. We use a variety of tests to do that, to really paint a really good picture of what the student can and can't do. Where are the holes? Where are the gaps in their learning? Okay? Where are they delayed in their learning? So that's another really critical piece of that non-discriminatory evaluation. And then when we identify those gaps and those holes in their learning, we identify those areas where they're struggling, that really guides us then in identifying what special education services and related services are necessary. So if we do an assessment, we identify, hey, this student is really delayed in language development, in the number of words that they use on a daily basis. Well, that really ties into speech-related services, right? So we would know that we would get a speech-language pathologist involved in providing services for that student. Or if we have a student who is not toileting appropriately, okay? That would be a great related service to address. That would be occupational therapy. So we would get OT involved with that student. So really that evaluation happens first, and then it really allows us to connect those related services to the gaps and areas of need that we identify. The third IDEA principle is appropriate education, and I love that they make the connection to this, that it is individualized. This is so important and something we always have to keep in mind, okay? Just because Sarah receives this on our IEP doesn't mean that Ben's going to receive the same thing just because they're in the same grade level and they have the same disability. Okay, let's say if they're identified as having a learning disability. It's still individualized. It has to be individualized for Sarah and for Ben. It's required by IDEA. And that is what defines an appropriate education. So what is individualized? Well, we know that the objectives are. So what are the goals that we're trying to have the student reach within the school year? Those are individualized to that student. That means we don't have a set of goals for second grade that we work towards. All second graders work towards it. No, we individualize it for each student that has an IEP. We also individualize services, okay? So depending on what that student needs, those are the services that we provide. Also individualized conferences. I think this is so important, and the book really, I feel like the authors provided some great examples of how to individualize conferences, okay, when you're looking at really working with parents and creating this team atmosphere for IEP development. This is so critical, I think, for parents and for teachers and related service providers to really put in some effort on making these IEP conferences more of a team atmosphere. So one of the things that the author talks about is really preparing in advance, okay, and connecting with parents and students from the beginning. So, for example, maybe sending out a questionnaire to parents to get some feedback on what kind of goals do you want your child to aim for in the next year. What are kind of life goals that you have for your child? What are you thinking about life goal-wise? What are challenges for you at home? Sometimes those can be addressed in the IEP, right? And then really getting the parents' thoughts and expectations of kind of where they see the IEP going in the next year. One of the things that's also helpful during that conference time is to not address it as, okay, we've come in, the IEP's written, we're really just giving this information to the parents, and we're expecting their signature at the end of the meeting, giving us approval to implement the IEP. Okay, a lot of times that's how we see IEP meetings going, right? Because we get kind of consumed with that legal compliance side of it rather than the teamwork side of it. So walking in with a completed IEP sends the message to parents that I'm really just here to take this in and then sign my name at the end of the meeting, right? It doesn't really give us that feeling of providing input, having some say in where the IEP goes. And so that's why it's really important to communicate with parents before the meeting, and make sure you communicate with parents during the meeting that this is a working document. Things can change depending on where we see the needs as a team. Okay, I think it's really important. The other thing that helps with that, and it wasn't necessarily mentioned in the text, but I think it's really important, is allowing parents to maybe, if you have a draft of the IEP, sending that to them ahead of time. I'll tell you that IEP meetings can be overwhelming for parents. I've conducted many IEP meetings as a teacher myself, more than I can count. But it's totally different to sit on the other side of that table and be a parent, and have teachers talking about your child, talking about goals for your child, talking about assessments for your child. It's an overwhelming experience. And so even for me, having been through that process as a teacher, it's always helpful when I can read the IEP ahead of time, kind of digest the evaluation findings, and be able to come in with questions and maybe some ideas of things that I feel like we could add to the IEP to improve it for Josie. Okay? So I think that's just really important to be aware of. You know, how are you helping parents be active participants in that process? And just kind of being aware of their feelings about that process. I'll tell you, you know, on our daily basis, we see Josie as Josie. We don't see her necessarily as having a disability. And I'm always caught off guard every year at the IEP meeting when I start reading those evaluation results and I realize how far behind she is, you know, and it's really painting a picture of her disability, which it should. That's what it's intended for. But it always catches us off guard a little bit and reminds us that she's not developing the same as her peers. And there are emotions that go with that. And I think it's just important to be aware of that as teachers when you have parents sitting in that office, having those meetings with you. And as they go through K through 12, that gets a little bit more challenging. You know, by the time you get to middle school and high school, sometimes parents can be a little jaded by the process. So just being understanding of that a little bit, I think, goes a long way for parents. The next principle is least restrictive environment. And this is important. This is important for a number of reasons. First of all, having that presumption in favor of inclusion makes sure that we are ensuring access to the general ed curriculum. Okay? This is also contributing to the student not falling further behind. So if you think about, if you're doing a pull-out program, you've got third graders, you're doing pull-out for math, okay? So the students in the general ed classroom are having access to that general ed curriculum. Maybe you're doing a couple steps below what they're doing, but already that student with disabilities is getting further behind because they're not getting access to that general ed curriculum, okay? Sometimes it's more beneficial to have access to that general ed curriculum with accommodations and modifications than it is to not have access to it and maybe just really trying to master a particular skill that they haven't yet, that they need, that their peers are doing in the classroom. We really just have to weigh that as teachers, as experts in the field. That's where you can get input from general ed teachers, kind of on what kind of gap. I think that's important to ask. What kind of gap are we developing if we do pull out here? Okay? And really just making that presumption in favor of inclusion first instead of pull out first. There are so many things that go with inclusion beyond having access to the general ed curriculum that are so important. For example, you know, if you have a third grader that has some behavior issues and they're doing a pull out program, maybe they're working one-on-one with a para, well, they lose all this modeling that they would get if they were in that classroom watching their peers learn, okay, watching their peers study, watching their peers interact with each other, watching their peers interact with the teacher. All of these, for the most part, appropriate interactions that their peers are having, they're not getting that because they're in a pull-out program and they're not seeing that in the resource room. So, you know, inclusion it provides access to the general ed curriculum, but it also provides access to these typical developing peers who are forming social relationships, who are demonstrating what it looks like to learn and work appropriately. Those are really important things for our students to see. The other part of inclusion that we often miss is that extracurricular and non-academic inclusion. So are we providing opportunities for our students with disabilities, all as part of LRE in the least restrictive environment, to do things outside of the school day that the school is offering? Okay, so we're providing supports for them to do that. For example, last year we do our local elementary school has art class after school that the art teacher does for about 6 weeks. It's about an hour after school each week. Josie really wanted to do it. I really didn't know how it was going to work because she needed an interpreter. It wasn't something I could go in and interpret for her. And I was hesitant to ask the school about providing an interpreter, even though I really shouldn't have been. Josie's brother was going to the art class. She wanted to participate too, and she had a right to participate. And the school was very gracious in providing an interpreter and covering the cost of that interpreter for her to go to art class after school, and she loved it. It was a great social experience for her too, to be around some different kids and interacting with them. So it's really important that we consider how we help our students participate in some of those out-of-class experiences. Another part of IDEA and the principles involved in there, that procedural due process. So, we've talked about these 4 really critical principles for schools to follow. What do we do if schools don't follow those? What are the parents' rights? Well, they have built into the law procedural due process. So this kind of has 3 stages that it goes through where parents can bring a concern to the school, and you typically have a resolution session where you discuss what the issue is, try to come up with a resolution for that problem, okay? If that doesn't work, then they go into mediation, where you're going kind of delaying that due process hearing piece, but just going through mediation. You have some assistance in how the school talks about the issue with the parents. Typically someone expert comes in and kind of helps walk through that process of mediation, trying to come up with a resolution. If that still does not fix the issue that the school and the parents are having, then the parents can go to what's called a due process hearing. So it's kind of like a trial where you have some kind of impartial hearing officer. The state identifies who those folks are, and the school comes in. They can have an attorney. The parents come in, they have an attorney, and you kind of go through this cross-examination of witnesses, very much like a typical hearing. And then that hearing officer will make a decision, okay? Parents and the LEA can also even, if they're not happy with the hearing officer's decision, they can appeal that to the state or federal level. This doesn't get to that hearing stage very often. Typically in mediation, we solve the problem. Whatever disagreement that the school and the parents are having typically is resolved within mediation. But you will hear from time to time schools going through that procedural due process all the way to the hearing stage. And this is just kind of a safeguard that's built in for parents if they feel like their child's rights are not being met. So when we talk about parent and student rights, parent-student participation is very much part of the IDEA 6 principles. This is where we get into, we have procedural rights, so anywhere from requesting evaluation to how many days notice do you have to receive before a meeting. All of that falls under procedural rights. Parents also have rights to have access to student records at any time, and also being able to provide permission for anyone to have access to those records, okay? And then those dispute resolution techniques that we talked about, that also falls under parent and student participation. I think it's important for us to consider, especially as you work with middle school and high school students, how they participate in their IEP process. That's something that we will look at later this semester, kind of ways to foster their participation and really get them involved in that goal creation, thinking about what they want to do when they get out of school, being involved in that transition process. That's all really critical for students to be involved in. So that kind of covers the IDA 6 principles. I think it's important for us to really keep those in mind as we're working with students with disabilities, as we're developing IEPs, interacting with families. You know, those are the things that are going to guide you in making good decisions about how you're serving students with disabilities. And so it's really important for us to have a good understanding of those principles. What I want you to do next is take a look at those chapter review questions. You will find answers for those in this video as well as in your chapter. And remember, if you have any questions about those chapter review, or if you would like me to take a look at a draft for you just to give you feedback, don't hesitate to email me, send me a draft. Even if you've got one question done, you want to know if you're answering this in the way that I'm kind of looking for, shoot it to me. I'll take a look at it and give you some feedback.